My son stood in my living room, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and told me he would handle my medical insurance so I could finally relax and enjoy my retirement. I trusted my own flesh and blood, so I handed over the documents and stopped checking the mail. For 8 months, my life felt perfectly secure and managed. Then the black ice on my driveway gave way, my leg shattered into pieces, and the hospital billing department delivered a message that destroyed my family forever. They told me I had absolutely no coverage. Before I tell you exactly how I uncovered the truth and dismantled his perfect life, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe betrayal from your own blood is the worst kind of theft. I am Larry Campbell, 67 years old, and I spent 40 years of my life as a commercial heating and cooling contractor in the freezing suburbs of Chicago. I built my life on calluses, split knuckles, and 60-hour work weeks hauling heavy equipment up metal ladders in the dead of winter. My late wife and I sacrificed every luxury so our only son Brent could attend a prestigious business school and build a life free from physical labor. Brent achieved exactly that. He became a wealth manager operating out of a sleek glass office downtown, trading my steel-toed boots for custom-tailored Italian suits. I was fiercely proud of him. That pride made me blind to the creeping arrogance that had slowly infected his character. The nightmare began on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in late spring. Brent dropped by my house unannounced, carrying a polished leather briefcase. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had helped him with his high school math homework, and expressed deep concern about my financial organization. He told me that keeping track of my premium Medicare supplement, my secondary health policies, and the substantial whole life insurance policy my wife had insisted we buy was too much of a burden for a man my age. He spoke to me with a smooth, patronizing tone, the kind of voice a person uses to comfort a confused child. He promised to consolidate all my accounts under his firm's umbrella. He assured me he would automate the premiums and save me the headache of endless paperwork. I handed him the heavy manila folder containing every vital document protecting my health and my legacy. He snapped his briefcase shut, patted my shoulder, and drove away in his spotless luxury sedan. I felt a profound sense of relief, entirely unaware that I had just handed a thief the keys to my survival. For the first few months, the transition appeared seamless. The thick envelopes from the insurance carriers stopped cluttering my mailbox, just as Brent had promised. But as summer faded into a bitter Chicago autumn, small, unsettling anomalies began to surface. I would call Brent on a Sunday afternoon just to catch up, only to be sent straight to his automated voicemail. Days would pass before he returned the call, and when he finally did, his voice was tight, rushed, and laced with an underlying panic. He constantly complained about a severe market downturn, aggressive margin calls, and the immense stress of keeping his wealth management firm afloat during an economic squeeze. He claimed he was working 90-hour weeks just to keep the lights on. I believed his stress was genuine until I opened my laptop and looked at the social media pages of my daughter-in-law, Monica. Monica was 36 years old, deeply obsessed with optics status and proving her wealth to strangers on the internet. While Brent was supposedly drowning in corporate debt and market crashes, Monica was posting high-resolution photographs of a brand-new, fully loaded Porsche utility vehicle parked in their driveway. The caption boasted about an early anniversary gift. 2 weeks later, my timeline was flooded with videos of Monica and Brent drinking expensive champagne in a private ski lodge in Aspen, Colorado. They were wearing thousands of dollars in designer winter gear. The mathematics of their life did not align. A man fighting off bankruptcy does not buy a German sports car and fly first class to a luxury ski resort. A heavy, cold knot formed in my stomach. My gut instinct, honed by decades of dealing with dishonest suppliers and shady contractors, screamed that something was deeply wrong. But I forcefully suppressed that feeling. I rationalized the discrepancy. I told myself that Brent was simply a successful financial expert who knew how to leverage debt, and that Monica was just exaggerating their lifestyle for her friends. I refused to entertain the horrific thought that my son was lying to me. That willful ignorance remained intact until the brutal reality of a Chicago winter forced the truth into the light. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late January. The temperature had plummeted overnight, coating the entire neighborhood in a nearly invisible layer of black ice. I stepped out of my front door to grab the morning newspaper, wearing boots with worn-out rubber soles. My left foot hit the top step, slipped backward, and all of my weight came crashing down awkwardly on my right leg. I heard the sickening sharp crack of the bone before I even hit the frozen concrete. The pain was immediate and blinding. It was not a dull ache, but a searing white-hot agony that radiated from my shin up to my chest, stealing the breath directly from my lungs. I lay on the freezing driveway, staring up at the gray, overcast sky, unable to move a single muscle without sending shockwaves of torment through my nervous system. My right leg was bent at a horrifying, unnatural angle. I managed to reach into my coat pocket, pull out my cellular phone with trembling, numb fingers, and dial for emergency services. The ambulance ride was a blur of flashing red lights, the sharp smell of antiseptic, and the piercing wail of the siren. The paramedics pumped strong painkillers into my veins, but the sheer trauma of the shattered tibia kept me completely tethered to the agony. They wheeled me through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room, bypassing the waiting area entirely due to the severity of the compound fracture. Doctors in blue scrubs surrounded my bed, cutting away my heavy winter trousers to examine the damage. The orthopedic surgeon informed me that the bone had splintered. I required immediate complex reconstructive surgery involving titanium plates and heavy screws to save the functionality of my leg. I nodded weakly, utterly exhausted by the pain, simply wanting the nightmare to end. I was stabilized and moved to a temporary holding bay to wait for an available operating theater. A young woman from the hospital billing department approached my bed. She carried a digital tablet and wore a sympathetic yet strictly professional expression. She asked for my current health insurance card to process the surgical authorization. I told her the name of my premium carrier and proudly explained that my son, a professional wealth manager, handled the consolidated account. I gave her my social security number so she could pull the active policy from their database. She tapped the screen of her tablet for several minutes. Her brow furrowed. She tapped the screen again, her expression shifting from mild confusion to deep concern. She stepped away to make a phone call. When she returned to my bedside, the sympathetic smile was entirely gone, replaced by the grim look of someone delivering a death sentence. She looked me directly in the eyes and stated clearly that my premium health insurance policy had been permanently canceled for non-payment exactly 6 months ago. She checked the secondary policies. They had been entirely liquidated. I stared at her, the heavy narcotic painkillers fighting against the sudden sharp spike of adrenaline in my blood. I told her there had to be a catastrophic clerical error. I explained that my son managed the premiums directly from my retirement accounts. The billing administrator shook her head slowly. She informed me that there was no error on the hospital's end nor the carrier's end. The accounts were dead. Because I was currently uninsured, and because the reconstructive surgery was classified as a highly complex emergency procedure, the hospital required a massive out-of-pocket deposit before the surgeon could begin. She handed me a printed estimate. The total required immediately was $45,000. The blinding pain in my leg was suddenly eclipsed by a suffocating, terrifying realization. Brent had not forgotten to pay a bill. A man does not accidentally cancel 3 separate insurance policies and liquidate a whole life asset. My son had looked me in the eyes, taken the protective armor I had built over 40 years of backbreaking labor, and quietly sold it. The Porsche, the Aspen vacation, the designer clothes. They were not the fruits of his financial genius. They were bought with my stolen security. As the surgical nurses wheeled me toward the operating room demanding a credit card to secure my fractured bones, the shock faded entirely. It was replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute clarity. The illusion of my family was dead, and I was going to make sure the man who killed it paid for every single drop of my blood. I stared at the young woman in the navy blue scrubs. I asked her to repeat what she just said, hoping the heavy doses of morphine had simply scrambled my hearing. She looked down at her digital tablet and softly repeated the devastating truth. My primary medical insurance had been officially terminated. The last premium payment was recorded exactly 6 months and 12 days ago. After a 90-day grace period of ignored warnings and unreturned phone calls, the provider had permanently closed the account. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, completely unrelated to the shattered bones in my right leg. I told her to check the secondary accounts. My late wife Diane had been a meticulous planner. Before she passed away, she insisted we purchase a backup catastrophic health plan and a substantial whole life policy with a cash value option. I practically begged the hospital administrator to run my Social Security number one more time. I told her those secondary policies were ironclad. She tapped the screen again. The silence in the emergency holding bay stretched out, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. The monitor began to beep faster. She looked up, her eyes filled with genuine pity. She informed me that the secondary catastrophic policy had been canceled the exact same week as the primary. Then she delivered the final blow. The whole life policy no longer existed. It had not been canceled. It had been fully liquidated for its cash value. My breath caught in my throat. I asked her exactly how much cash had been withdrawn. She hesitated, stating she could only see the closure code, but the notes indicated a full payout was wired directly to the managing broker. The managing broker was my son, Brent. The room began to spin. 6 months ago. The timeline aligned perfectly with the moment Brent stopped answering my Sunday phone calls. It aligned perfectly with his sudden complaints about market downturns and margin calls. It also aligned perfectly with the exact month my daughter-in-law had proudly displayed her brand-new luxury vehicle on the internet. My son had not made a clerical error. He had deliberately stopped paying the premiums that kept me alive. He had intercepted the warning letters, and then he had drained the life insurance policy my dead wife had bought to protect me. The administrator shifted her weight nervously. She apologized profusely, but she had a job to do. She explained the brutal reality of the medical system. Because I was currently classified as uninsured, the hospital protocol for a complex orthopedic reconstruction was strictly transactional. The surgeon could set the bone manually and put my leg in a standard cast. But without the titanium plates and the reconstructive joint work, the surgeon guaranteed I would walk with a severe limp and suffer from chronic pain for the rest of my life. I would likely need a cane or a walker permanently. If I wanted the proper surgery to fully restore my mobility, the hospital required an immediate deposit to cover the surgical suite, the anesthesiologist, and the hardware. I asked her how much. My voice sounded completely hollow. She handed me a printed estimate from her clipboard. The total was $45,000. She needed a credit card or a certified wire transfer before they would wheel me into the operating theater. $45,000. For a man living on a fixed pension who thought his medical expenses were fully covered, it was an insurmountable mountain. I laid my head back against the thin hospital pillow and closed my eyes. The physical agony radiating from my shattered tibia was entirely eclipsed by the crushing weight of betrayal. I had spent 40 years freezing on commercial rooftops, destroying my own knees and back so my son would never have to worry about money. I had paid for his college tuition. I had paid for his extravagant wedding. I had handed him my entire life to manage, and he had traded my physical safety for a German sports car and a ski trip to Colorado. He had looked at my life savings and decided his social status was more important than my health. The anger did not come as an explosive rage. It came as a slow, freezing current creeping through my veins. It sharpened my mind. I opened my eyes and looked at the printed estimate again. I did not cry. I did not panic. I simply realized that the boy I had raised was gone. The man occupying those custom-tailored suits was a parasite, and I was not going to let a parasite leave me crippled. I asked the administrator to give me 10 minutes alone to make a phone call. She nodded sympathetically, probably assuming I was about to call my wealthy son to beg for financial rescue. She left the cubicle and pulled the privacy curtain shut. I reached for my cellular phone on the bedside table. I did not dial Brent. Calling him would only give him the opportunity to lie, to make excuses, to manipulate the situation further. Calling him would show weakness, and I was entirely done being weak. I needed to secure my own survival first. Only then would I begin the process of dismantling his entire world. I stared at the black screen of my cellular phone. My thumb hovered over the contact icon that held my son's name. Every instinct I had as a father screamed at me to make excuses for him. I wanted to believe that a rogue broker had made a catastrophic mistake. I wanted to believe that the financial system had glitched. I wanted to believe absolutely anything other than the horrific truth staring me in the face. But the throbbing agony in my shattered right leg anchored me to reality. The billing administrator had left the curtain drawn, leaving me alone in the sterile, brightly lit cubicle. I took a deep, jagged breath, pressed the green button, and lifted the phone to my ear. The line rang 3 times. When the call finally connected, I did not hear the concerned voice of a son answering his elderly father. I heard the clinking of expensive crystal glassware, the low murmur of wealthy patrons, and the pulsating rhythm of background jazz music. Brent was at a high-end restaurant. He answered the phone with a sharp, impatient sigh. He asked me what was so urgent, complaining that he was in the middle of a critical lunch meeting with a prospective client. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not notice the heavy, strained rhythm of my breathing over the phone. He was completely absorbed in his own performance of success. I forced my voice to remain steady, refusing to let the physical pain bleed into my words. I told him that I was in the emergency room at the county hospital. I explained that I had stepped onto the driveway, slipped on the black ice, and suffered a severe compound fracture in my right leg. I waited for a gasp. I waited for the sudden silence of a man realizing his father was in peril. I waited for him to drop his expensive fork, excuse himself from his client, and ask which hospital I was at so he could rush over. Instead, there was a brief pause followed by a long, irritated exhale. He told me that was unfortunate, but asked why I was calling him in the middle of the trading day. He said the hospital knew how to set a broken bone and told me to just let the doctors do their job. The sheer lack of basic human empathy was a physical blow heavier and colder than the fall on the concrete. I gripped the plastic railing of the hospital bed so tightly my knuckles turned white. I told him the doctors could not do their job. I told him the billing department had just informed me that my primary medical insurance had been canceled 6 months ago for non-payment. The background noise on his end of the line seemed to muffle for a fraction of a second. When he spoke again, his voice dropped an octave, shifting instantly into the smooth, practiced tone he used to handle angry clients. He let out a forced, condescending chuckle. He told me the hospital administration was completely incompetent. He claimed there was simply a minor clerical error with the automated clearinghouse system at his brokerage firm. He assured me he would have his personal assistant call the provider first thing in the morning to sort out the routing numbers. He was lying. The smooth cadence of his voice was flawless, but I had spent 30 years negotiating with slippery supply vendors and dishonest contractors. I knew the exact sound of a man trying to buy time to cover his tracks. I did not let him off the hook. I pressed forward, tightening the trap. I told him the hospital did not care about routing numbers tomorrow morning. I told him I needed complex reconstructive surgery involving titanium plates immediately, and the hospital required a $45,000 out-of-pocket deposit right now because I was officially classified as uninsured. Brent let out a sharp click of his tongue. The facade of the helpful wealth manager began to crack under the pressure. He told me I was overreacting to a standard medical billing procedure. He instructed me to just pull out my primary credit card, put the deposit on my personal account, and he promised he would reimburse me when the clerical error was fixed next week. I looked down at my swollen, discolored leg wrapped in temporary splints. I asked him how I was supposed to put $45,000 on a credit card with a $10,000 limit. I reminded him that I lived on a fixed pension, a pension he knew every single detail of because he was the one managing my finances. The silence stretched tight across the cellular connection. I could hear him walking his leather shoes clicking against a hard floor as he stepped away from his restaurant table to find a private corner. His voice grew hushed, but the irritation boiled over into open hostility. He asked me why I was being so difficult. He accused me of trying to embarrass him with trivial demands while he was trying to secure a massive corporate account that would benefit our entire family. I closed my eyes. The final thread of my denial, the last desperate hope that my son was a good man, snapped completely. I asked him about my late wife. I asked him about the whole life insurance policy Diane had purchased specifically to prevent a financial disaster like this. I told him the hospital ran my social security number and the policy was gone. I did not ask him if it was another clerical error. I told him I knew it had been liquidated for cash and wired directly to his management firm. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a thief caught completely red-handed in the dark. He did not deny it. He did not try to invent another imaginary broker or blame the computer system. When he finally spoke, his voice was entirely stripped of affection or respect. It was cold, metallic, and dripping with defensive contempt. He told me that he had to leverage those obsolete assets to cover a temporary liquidity crisis at his firm. He claimed he was protecting my overall portfolio by keeping his company afloat during a market downturn. He completely bypassed the horrific fact that he had forged my signature to drain my life savings. I felt my heart rate steady. The shock was entirely gone. I asked him if his terrible liquidity crisis was the reason his wife Monica was driving a brand new luxury vehicle. I asked him if the stolen insurance money was the reason they were posting videos of themselves drinking champagne at a private ski lodge in Colorado. Brent lost his temper completely. He practically hissed into the receiver, abandoning all pretense of being a son. He told me I had no idea how the modern financial world worked. He said maintaining an appearance of extreme wealth was the absolute only way to attract high net worth investors to his firm. He called the stolen money an aggressive internal loan. He told me I was being unbelievably selfish for worrying about a broken bone when his entire corporate reputation and livelihood were on the line. I did not raise my voice. I asked him one final question. I asked him what I was supposed to do right now, lying in a hospital bed in agonizing pain, needing $45,000 to ever walk normally again. My son did not hesitate. The words left his mouth like poisoned darts. He told me he was completely illiquid right now and could not spare a single dime. He told me to stop acting like a helpless old man and just deal with the basic cast the hospital offered. And then he delivered the final unforgivable blow that severed our blood tie forever. He said, "Do not make your clumsiness my financial crisis." The line went dead. I slowly pulled the phone away from my ear. I listened to the hollow rhythmic tone of the disconnected call. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not weep into my hands. The searing pain in my leg faded into the background, completely overridden by a profound, icy calm that settled deep into my chest. My own flesh and blood had just left me to suffer in a county hospital. He had stolen the money my dead wife saved to protect me, spent it on his own towering vanity, and then blamed me for slipping on the ice. He assumed I was just a tired, technologically illiterate old man who would quietly accept his grim fate. He assumed I had no hidden resources left. He assumed he held absolute power over my life. He was severely mistaken. 3 years before Brent ever offered to manage my daily finances, I had sold the massive commercial warehouse that housed my old heating and cooling business. It was a private cash transaction with a commercial developer. Because Brent had always looked down on my blue-collar business, I had placed the massive proceeds of that sale into a private high-yield trust account through a completely different banking institution. Brent did not know the account existed because I had intended to surprise him with the funds when he had his first child. I opened my phone's internet browser and navigated to the secure banking portal. I looked at the balance. It was more than enough to cover the surgery, the extended hospital stay, and the top-tier private physical therapy I would need. I bypassed Brent entirely and authorized a direct, irrevocable wire transfer to the hospital's billing department. As the digital confirmation screen loaded, the last remnants of my grief dissolved entirely. It was replaced by a sharp, methodical, and ruthless focus. Brent believed he had drained my life dry. He believed he was the smartest man in the city. I was going to let him continue believing that right up until the moment I dragged his crimes into the light and tore his entire stolen empire down to the concrete foundation. The silence in the emergency room felt entirely different now. It was no longer the heavy silence of an injured man waiting for a rescue that would never come. It was the sharp and hollow silence of a battlefield just before the first shot is fired. I placed my cellular phone face down on the bedside table. I did not shed a single tear. The man who had just hung up the phone was not the boy I had raised. That boy had died somewhere along the way. He had been buried alive under piles of designer clothes, exclusive country club memberships, and a desperate hunger for social validation. In his place stood a financial predator who viewed his own father as nothing more than an expendable resource. My grief evaporated instantly. The searing pain radiating from my shattered tibia remained, but it no longer terrified me. It served as a burning reminder of the exact price of my blind trust. Brent had always vastly underestimated me. He assumed that because I had spent my entire adult life wearing denim work shirts and steel-toed boots, I lacked the intellectual capacity to understand complex financial maneuvers. He genuinely believed that true wealth only existed inside glass skyscrapers and on digital trading platforms. He had completely forgotten the immense tangible value of commercial real estate in the industrial sectors of Chicago. 3 years before I handed him my personal medical paperwork, I had quietly sold the massive warehouse that served as the headquarters for my commercial heating and cooling business. It was a sprawling facility situated on a highly desirable plot of land near the major freight rail lines. A massive commercial logistics firm had approached me directly with a private all-cash offer that far exceeded the current market value. I signed the contracts in a modest lawyer office without telling a single soul in my family. I took the entire sum of that sale, which numbered in the high 7 figures, and placed it into a private high-yield trust account. The account was managed by a boutique independent banking institution that was completely disconnected from the flashy corporate financial circles Brent operated within. I had originally intended to leave that trust entirely untouched until Brent welcomed his first child into the world. I wanted to secure the college educations of my future grandchildren so they would never have to worry about student debt. Now that hidden account was no longer a gift. It was my war chest. I pressed the red plastic call button pinned to my hospital gown. A few moments later, the same young billing administrator pulled back the privacy curtain. She carried her digital tablet tightly against her chest, her expression braced for an emotional breakdown. She clearly expected me to beg for a long-term payment plan or ask to be immediately transferred to a low-income state facility. I did not give her the chance to offer her practiced sympathies. I asked her for a pen and a standard hospital authorization form for electronic wire transfers. She looked at me completely bewildered by the sudden shift in my demeanor. My voice was no longer shaking from the shock of betrayal. My posture, despite the broken leg anchoring me to the bed, was entirely rigid and commanding. I recited the routing numbers and the private account details from perfect memory. I authorized an immediate transfer of $50,000 directly to the hospital billing department, adding an extra $5,000 to cover any unexpected surgical complications that might arise during the operation. The administrator typed the numbers into her tablet with trembling fingers. Less than 2 minutes later, the screen flashed with a bright green confirmation code. The funds had cleared instantly. The look of absolute shock on her face was deeply satisfying. She quietly thanked me, gathered her paperwork, and hurried away down the hall to inform the orthopedic surgical team that I was ready. The wheels of my hospital bed began to roll down the brightly lit corridor toward the main operating theater. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered in a steady hypnotic rhythm above me. The surgical nurses buzzed around my bed, adjusting intravenous lines and continuously monitoring my vital signs. The anesthesiologist leaned over my face, explaining the countdown process as he prepared to push the heavy chemical sedative into my bloodstream. He told me to count backward from 10 and think of a peaceful, happy memory to relax my mind. I did not close my eyes. I did not think of a peaceful memory. I thought of my son sitting in a 5-star restaurant downtown. I pictured him drinking expensive wine bought with my stolen life insurance, laughing with wealthy clients, while I lay on a freezing concrete driveway, unable to breathe. I counted backward with absolute clarity. 10, 9, 8. The medication flooded my veins like liquid ice, numbing the edges of my physical pain. 7, 6, 5. The busy operating room began to blur into a wash of bright lights and blue scrubs, but my mind remained locked onto a single, unbreakable promise. I was going to survive this surgery, and then I was going to systematically destroy his entire fabricated life. I woke up several hours later in a private, quiet recovery suite. The room was dark, illuminated only by the soft green glow of the medical monitors keeping track of my heart rate. My right leg was encased in a heavy plaster cast and elevated on a large stack of stiff pillows. The dull, throbbing ache of the deep surgical incisions had finally replaced the sharp, blinding agony of the splintered bone. A young nurse entered the room quietly to check my vitals and offer me a small cup of ice chips. She smiled warmly and told me the complicated operation was a complete success. The surgeon had successfully installed 2 heavy titanium plates and a dozen steel screws to permanently stabilize the tibia. I thanked her politely for her excellent care and asked her to leave the heavy wooden door completely closed on her way out. I needed absolute isolation. The heavy narcotic painkillers still clouded my physical senses, but my mind was operating with a cold, terrifying efficiency. The comforting illusion of my secure, peaceful retirement was completely dead. The comforting illusion of my loving, successful son was completely dead. I had to face the brutal reality of my situation without flinching. Brent had not just stolen my medical premiums to buy his wife a luxury car. If a man is desperate enough to liquidate his own father's whole life insurance policy to cover a temporary liquidity crisis, he has likely crossed far more dangerous legal lines. I realized in that quiet hospital room that my stolen medical premiums were just the visible smoke. There had to be a massive raging fire burning through the rest of my financial portfolio. I could not simply strike back in anger. I could not just call him and scream about the stolen money. A predator like Brent would simply deny everything, hire an aggressive legal team, and find a way to manipulate the narrative to make me look like a confused, senile old man. I needed to know the exact dimensions of the battlefield before I took a single step forward. I needed to see every single forged signature, every illegal wire transfer, and every empty retirement account before I made my next calculated move. I was no longer an exhausted old man recovering from a terrible fall on the ice. I was a veteran structural engineer meticulously mapping out the exact weak points of a towering, corrupt building before setting the final demolition charges. The surgery had fixed my broken bones, but the betrayal had forged a brand new spine. I reached over to the bedside table and picked up my cellular phone again. I completely ignored the missed text messages from my neighbors asking if I was all right. I opened my contact list and scrolled past my family members. I was ready to summon the arsenal I needed to bring my son to his knees. The morning light crept slowly through the plastic blinds of my private recovery room. It painted pale yellow lines across the sterile white blankets covering my cast. The heavy intravenous narcotics from the surgery were finally beginning to wear off. They left behind a dull, throbbing ache deep inside my newly reconstructed shin. But my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I lay perfectly still and listened to the rhythmic hum of the hospital ventilation system. I had survived the absolute worst night of my life. Now it was time to systematically dismantle the man who put me here. I reached for my cellular phone resting on the rolling tray table next to my bed. I knew I could not rely on a single piece of paper Brent had given me over the last 8 months. Every quarterly report and every digital summary he had provided was completely compromised. I needed to bypass his wealth management firm entirely. I needed the raw and unfiltered truth directly from the source. I opened the internet browser on my phone and searched for the corporate contact information of the massive insurance conglomerates that issued my policies. I bypassed the local broker extensions and found the direct fraud and account retention departments. I dialed the primary medical insurance carrier first. I navigated the automated menu prompts with absolute patience. I did not rush. When a live representative finally answered the line, I provided my social security number and my exact date of birth. I kept my voice flat and authoritative. I asked her to pull up the closed account and read me the exact timeline of the cancellation. The representative typed loudly on her keyboard. She confirmed what the hospital billing administrator had told me yesterday. The policy was completely dead. But I needed to know exactly how it died. I asked her where the late payment warning letters had been sent prior to the final cancellation date. She paused and read the account notes aloud. She told me that 7 months ago, an authorized agent had logged into the digital portal and changed my primary residential mailing address to a corporate post office box downtown. That box belonged to my son. Brent had deliberately diverted all the warning notices so I would never see them arrive at my house. He had carefully orchestrated my vulnerability in absolute silence, ensuring I would remain completely ignorant while he stopped paying the bills. I thanked the woman for her time and ended the call. The medical insurance was just the beginning of the investigation. I needed to know the fate of the whole life insurance policy. This was the policy my late wife Diane had purchased over 20 years ago. She had worked double shifts at the local bakery just to afford the initial premiums when my contracting business was first starting out. She wanted to guarantee that if anything ever happened to the economy, we would never lose our home. The policy had slowly grown into a massive asset with a guaranteed cash value of $250,000. It was the financial anchor of my entire retirement plan and a sacred promise to my dead wife. I dialed the secondary corporate number and asked to be transferred immediately to a senior account specialist. A man with a deep professional voice answered the line. I identified myself and gave him the old policy number from memory. I told him I needed a comprehensive summary of the recent account activity. The man fell silent for a long moment. I could hear the slow clicking of his computer mouse as he navigated the massive digital archives. When he finally spoke, his tone was cautious and highly regulated. He informed me that the policy no longer existed in their active database. I told him I knew it was gone, but I needed to know the exact mechanism of its closure. I asked him if it had lapsed due to unpaid premiums, just like the medical coverage. The specialist cleared his throat nervously. He told me it did not lapse. He stated very clearly that the entire policy had been actively surrendered for its maximum cash value exactly 4 months ago. A freezing current washed over my chest. I asked him to repeat the exact amount that was paid out by the corporation. He confirmed that $250,000 had been fully liquidated and transferred out of the secure holding account. I gripped the plastic edge of my phone tightly. I asked the specialist exactly how a massive financial asset like that could be surrendered without the primary policyholder walking into a physical branch office and presenting a government-issued identification card. The man explained the modern digital infrastructure of his corporate financial company. He said that my registered financial power of attorney had submitted a digital surrender request through their secure executive broker portal. I asked him whose name was listed on that authorized power of attorney document. He read my son's name aloud. I felt my jaw clench so tightly my teeth began to ache. Brent had not just stopped paying my bills to save a few dollars a month. He had executed a premeditated and highly complex financial theft. I asked the specialist where the $250,000 had been sent after the policy was successfully liquidated. He read the routing numbers of the destination account. It was the primary corporate holding account for Brent's wealth management firm. My son had stolen the money my dead wife bled for, and he poured it directly into his failing business to keep his wealthy facade intact. He had traded decades of his mother's hard work and sacrifice to fund luxury vacations and lease a German sports car. I asked the specialist one final crucial question. I asked him whose signature was physically attached to the final surrender authorization document that released the funds. He checked the digital file again and told me my signature was clearly visible on the electronic form. I told him I had never signed a document authorizing the liquidation of that policy. I told him I had never been in the same room as that specific paperwork, and I had never given verbal or written consent to touch those funds. The specialist grew very quiet. The casual customer service tone completely vanished from his voice. He advised me that if I believed fraudulent activity had occurred, I needed to contact local law enforcement immediately to file an official report. He offered to freeze my entire profile and flag the massive transaction for an internal corporate investigation. I told him to lock the profile down completely so no further digital access could be granted. But I firmly instructed him not to contact the managing broker under any circumstances. I did not want Brent to receive an automated electronic alert that his crimes were being actively investigated. I thanked the man for his absolute clarity and disconnected the call. I placed the phone back on the tray table. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was staggering. Brent had forged my signature on federal financial documents. He had committed severe wire fraud and aggravated elder abuse. He had stolen $250,000 in cold cash while smiling at me across my own kitchen table. This was no longer a tragic family dispute over a neglected medical bill or a temporary lack of liquid funds. This was a massive criminal enterprise operating right under my nose and executed by the person I trusted most in the world. I looked down at my shattered leg encased in the heavy white plaster cast. The physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the cold fury expanding in my chest. Brent thought he was untouchable because he wore expensive custom suits and used complicated financial jargon to intimidate normal people. He thought he could steal my life savings, and I would just quietly accept my grim fate because I was an old blue-collar worker who did not understand computers. He assumed I was entirely helpless. He was severely mistaken. I was old, but I was certainly not helpless. I was wide awake and I knew exactly what I had to do next. I could not fight a corrupt wealth manager alone from a hospital bed. I needed an ally who deeply understood the dark and complicated side of corporate financial theft. I needed someone who possessed the legal authority to tear through Brent's sophisticated corporate defenses and expose his fraudulent empire directly to the federal government. I picked up my phone one more time. I bypassed the family contacts entirely. I scrolled down until I found the private number of an old friend. His name was Stuart Reed. Stuart was a razor-sharp federal fraud attorney I had met decades ago during my time as a commercial union contractor. He was a man who specialized in dismantling corrupt executives and returning stolen assets to their rightful owners. I pressed the call button and listened to the steady ringing tone. I was ready to summon the perfect weapon to execute my absolute and inescapable revenge. I held the phone to my ear and listened to the dial tone. Stuart Reed answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I told him I was sitting in a hospital bed with a shattered leg and a completely empty whole life insurance policy. I told him my own son had forged my signature and stolen $250,000 to prop up his failing wealth management firm. Stuart did not gasp. He did not ask if I was sure. He had spent 30 years hunting white-collar criminals and prosecuting corporate fraud. He simply asked for my room number and told me to make sure the door was closed. An hour later, the heavy wooden door of my recovery room pushed open. Stuart slipped inside like a shadow. He wore a faded trench coat over a sharp, tailored suit. He carried a heavy reinforced briefcase. He locked the door behind him and pulled a plastic visitor chair directly up to my bedside. He did not offer empty sympathy regarding my broken leg. He knew I needed a weapon, not a shoulder to cry on. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a high-performance laptop and a portable encrypted cellular router. He told me the hospital wireless network was completely unsecure and we were going to bypass it entirely. He booted up a specialized forensic accounting program used by federal investigators to track laundered money. Stewart asked for my social security number, my date of birth, and the exact names of the banking institutions where my money was originally held. His fingers moved across the keyboard with terrifying speed. The sterile hospital room with its beeping medical monitors was instantly transformed into a high-stakes war room. He bypassed the polished consumer websites and accessed the raw institutional ledgers. The screen filled with lines of complex routing numbers and digital timestamps. I watched the glowing screen as Stewart began to untangle the massive web of lies my son had spun over the last 8 months. We started with my monthly retirement annuities. Brent had promised to automate these steady deposits into a high-yield savings account to generate passive interest for my future medical care. Stewart pulled up the destination routing numbers and shook his head slowly. The money had never touched a savings account. Every single month, the exact amount of my hard-earned pension was automatically diverted into a private checking account registered exclusively under Monica's name. Stewart pulled the transaction history for that specific account. It was a digital graveyard of my stolen labor. I saw thousands of dollars spent at high-end beauty salons, luxury clothing boutiques, and expensive downtown restaurants. I saw the massive down payment for the new Porsche utility vehicle. I saw the expensive flight upgrades for their ski trip to Colorado. My freezing mornings on commercial rooftops had been directly converted into designer handbags and imported champagne. The anger burned hot in my chest, but I remained completely silent. Then Stewart moved to the main target. The $250,000 from my surrendered whole life insurance policy. This was the money my late wife Diane had scraped together to protect me. Stewart traced the massive wire transfer. He watched it leave the insurance conglomerate and land directly in the primary operating account of Brent's wealth management firm. But the money did not sit there. It was immediately fractured into dozens of smaller payments. Stewart ran a deeper diagnostic on the firm's overall financial health. The numbers painted a picture of absolute desperation. Brent was not a financial genius. He was a reckless gambler wearing a custom suit. He had heavily leveraged his clients' portfolios in highly volatile markets, and the market had crashed. His firm was drowning in massive margin calls. He owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to aggressive institutional lenders. When the lenders came knocking, Brent panicked. He could not admit failure. He could not bear the thought of losing his wealthy social status and returning to a normal life. So he turned to the easiest and most trusting target he could find: his own father. He forged my signature, cashed out my life insurance, and threw my dead wife's sacrifice directly into the fire just to keep his corporate doors open for a few more months. He had literally stolen my life to buy himself time. The illusion of his success was entirely funded by my quiet suffering. He was standing on a foundation built completely out of my stolen assets. Stewart leaned back in his chair and took off his reading glasses. He told me he had enough hard evidence to have Brent arrested for federal wire fraud and elder abuse by the end of the week. We had the routing numbers, the forged digital signatures, and the exact timestamps of the theft. The trap was fully loaded. But as Stewart began to close the encrypted tracking program, a flashing red notification appeared in the corner of his screen. Stewart put his glasses back on and opened the alert. It was a secondary credit inquiry. The federal software had detected a massive background check triggered by my social security number just 48 hours ago. Someone had pulled the original property deeds and the municipal tax records for my primary residence. Stewart's face turned completely pale. He looked at me and asked if I had recently applied to borrow money against the equity of my house. I told him I owned the house completely and had not borrowed a single dime since Diane died. I told him the mortgage was fully paid off 10 years ago. Stuart turned the laptop screen toward me. The chilling reality of Brent's absolute greed was staring us right in the face. The stolen insurance money had not been enough to save his failing business. The margin calls were still coming. My son was now targeting the very roof over my head. The flashing red notification on the corner of the computer screen cast a pale glow across the dark hospital room. Stuart did not speak immediately. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he read the encrypted text. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor. I watched the seasoned federal fraud attorney completely lose his composure for a brief second. He slowly turned his head to look at me, and the expression on his face sent a new wave of cold adrenaline straight into my bloodstream. Stuart told me that the federal software had just flagged a hard credit inquiry. A massive national bank had pulled my complete financial history, my credit score, and the original property deeds for my primary residence. Someone had initiated a major lending application using my social security number just 48 hours ago. They had requested the municipal tax records and the official property boundaries for the house I lived in. It was the house I had purchased over 30 years ago. It was the house where my late wife Diane had planted her rose bushes in the front yard. It was the house where I had raised the very son who was currently trying to destroy me. I asked Stuart to dig deeper and find out exactly what kind of loan application had been submitted to the bank. Stuart's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the public municipal portals and tunneling directly into the pending legal filings of the county clerk. He brought up a digital copy of the lending request. He did not look at me when he read the title of the document out loud. He said it was a formal application for a maximum payout reverse mortgage. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Even with my blue-collar background, I knew exactly what a reverse mortgage was. It was a financial tool designed for elderly people who were completely out of money. It allowed a homeowner to surrender the equity they had built up in their property over decades and convert it into immediate cash. The bank would give the homeowner a massive lump sum, and in exchange the bank would place a permanent, inescapable lien on the property. When the homeowner eventually passed away or moved to a nursing facility, the bank would immediately seize the house, sell it, and keep the proceeds. I had never applied for a reverse mortgage. I owned my home completely free and clear. I had paid off the final installment of my 30-year mortgage over a decade ago. I had spent countless weekends fixing the roof, upgrading the plumbing, and replacing the floorboards with my own two hands to ensure I would always have a safe place to sleep. In today's highly inflated real estate market, my property was officially appraised at $800,000. It was a massive untapped reservoir of pure financial equity. I stared at the glowing computer screen and asked Stuart how this was even remotely possible. I asked him how a person could initiate a massive loan against a property they did not own without the primary homeowner walking into a physical bank branch and signing the paperwork in front of a licensed loan officer. Stuart pulled up the supporting documents attached to the digital application. He clicked on a scanned file and expanded it to fill the entire screen. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. The document claimed that due to my advancing age and declining cognitive health, I had legally surrendered absolute control of my entire financial estate to my son. I looked at the bottom of the page. My signature was perfectly forged in black ink. Next to it was the bright blue stamp of a licensed public notary. Stuart examined the stamp and told me the notary was most likely a corrupt associate who worked at Brent's wealth management firm. The premeditation involved in this specific crime was absolutely staggering. Brent had not just panicked when his business started failing. He had meticulously planned this theft for months. He had drafted the fake legal documents, secured a fraudulent notary, and established his fake authority long before I ever slipped on the ice in my driveway. He had systematically built a shadow version of my life on paper, a version where I was a helpless, incompetent old man, and he was the benevolent savior managing my affairs. I asked Stuart to check the current processing status of the fraudulent loan. I needed to know how far along the application was in the banking system. Stuart navigated to the underwriter portal. His face grew incredibly grim as he read the digital timeline. The application was not just sitting in a pile on a desk, waiting to be reviewed. Brent had requested an expedited premium processing service. The bank had already completed the automated digital appraisal of my property. The corporate underwriter had already signed off on the preliminary risk assessment. There was only one final step left to complete the entire transaction. Stuart pointed his pen at a date highlighted in bright yellow text on the bank portal. It was the scheduled date for the final executive approval and the subsequent wire transfer of the loan funds. The date was this coming Friday. I looked at the digital clock on the wall of my hospital room. It was currently Tuesday evening. We had exactly 72 hours before a massive banking institution handed my son nearly $500,000 in pure cash drawn directly from the walls of my home. If that money dropped into the corporate accounts of Brent's failing wealth management firm, it would vanish instantly. It would be immediately seized by the aggressive institutional lenders he owed money to. It would be gone forever. And when the dust finally settled, the bank would still hold the legal lien on my house. I would be left with a massive debt I could never possibly repay on a fixed pension, and the bank would swiftly and legally evict me from my own home. Brent knew this. He was a professional wealth manager. He understood the absolute finality of a reverse mortgage better than anyone. He knew exactly what this would do to me. He was fully prepared to let a corporate bank seize the only home I had left. He was perfectly willing to make his severely injured father homeless, just to maintain his country club membership and his luxury vehicles for a few more months. He was going to leave me on the street with a shattered leg and absolutely nothing to my name. The profound depravity of his actions completely eradicated any lingering trace of paternal mercy I might have harbored. The freezing current in my chest hardened into solid ice. He was no longer my son. He was a hostile threat to my very survival, and I was going to treat him exactly like one. Stuart asked me if I wanted him to call the National Bank right now. He offered to use his federal credentials to instantly freeze the application flag, the account for severe identity theft, and stop the wire transfer from ever happening. I told him absolutely not. Stuart looked at me, surprised by my immediate refusal. I explained my reasoning. I told him that if we called the bank today and froze the application, the bank would automatically send an electronic alert to the managing broker. Brent would receive a notification on his phone within minutes. He would immediately know that I had discovered his massive fraud. A cornered animal is incredibly dangerous. If we gave him a 3-day warning, he would use that time to scramble his assets, destroy the digital evidence, shred the forged documents, and hire a team of aggressive defense lawyers to protect himself. He might even try to flee the jurisdiction before the authorities could build a solid case. We could not simply stop the transaction and let him slip away in the chaos. We had to let him walk right up to the very edge of the cliff, completely blind to the trap waiting for him. I asked Stuart what exact mechanism Brent needed to finalize the loan on Friday. Stuart reviewed the final banking requirements. He told me the bank needed one last set of physical signatures on the closing escrow documents to legally authorize the release of the funds. Because the loan was so massive, the digital power of attorney was no longer sufficient for the final step. Brent was going to need my actual physical signature on the closing papers to get the money. A grim, humorless smile touched my lips. The ticking clock was no longer a threat. It was the perfect opportunity. Brent was going to have to bring those closing documents directly to me. He was going to have to stand in my home, look me directly in the eye, and lie to my face one last time. He was going to pretend they were routine tax forms or standard insurance updates. And that was the exact moment the steel jaws of the trap would snap shut. I told Stuart we were going to let Friday come. I instructed him to prepare the federal injunctions, the civil lawsuits, and the criminal referrals in absolute total secrecy. I told him to gather every single piece of forensic accounting evidence we had uncovered tonight. We were not going to stop my son from trying to steal my house. We were going to let him believe he had won. We were going to let him schedule his victory party. And then, at the absolute height of his arrogance, we were going to tear his entire stolen empire down to the ground and make sure he never saw the sun outside of a federal prison yard again. I was discharged from the orthopedic ward of the county hospital on Thursday afternoon. The hospital administration provided a standard medical transport van to take me back to my quiet neighborhood. The ride was incredibly uncomfortable. Every bump in the road sent a dull, vibrating ache deep into the titanium plates newly screwed into my shin. Stepping through my own front door was a grueling and exhausting physical process. Maneuvering the heavy aluminum crutches up the concrete steps required an immense amount of upper body strength that I had not used in years. But the physical pain was completely secondary to the sharp, intense focus occupying my mind. I stood in the small foyer of my home and looked around at the familiar walls. The late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the hardwood floors. This was the house my late wife Diane and I had purchased over 30 years ago. I had completely rebuilt the brick fireplace with my own 2 hands. I had replaced every single shingle on the roof. Every inch of this property held a piece of my sweat and my history. And this was the exact house my own flesh and blood was actively trying to steal from right underneath me. I knew I did not have time to rest or feel sorry for myself. I moved slowly toward my oak study desk, located near the living room window. I pulled open the heavy top drawer. I reached past the neat stacks of old utility bills and pulled out a single black ballpoint pen. I had ordered it online using my cellular phone while lying awake in my hospital bed 2 nights ago. It looked exactly like a standard office pen you could buy at any local supply store. However, the ink inside the plastic cartridge was chemically engineered to completely evaporate when exposed to normal room temperature for more than 24 hours. I carried the pen into the kitchen and placed it carefully on the center of the wooden table right next to a stack of blank grocery lists. I wanted it to look like it was simply the closest writing utensil available. The stage was set. Now I just had to wait for the predator to arrive. The doorbell rang precisely at 6 o'clock in the evening. I took a deep, steadying breath, adjusted my grip on the rubber handles of the crutches, and slowly made my way down the hallway to the entryway. I unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the door open. Brent stood on the front porch wearing a pristine charcoal gray suit that undoubtedly cost more than my first automobile. His hair was perfectly styled, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Monica stood right next to him, wearing a thick designer wool coat and holding a greasy brown paper bag. The unmistakable smell of cheap fried rice and stale egg rolls drifted into my clean hallway. They were currently eating at 5-star steakhouses every other night, funded entirely by my stolen life insurance policy. But they brought me the absolute cheapest local takeout they could find for my medical recovery dinner. I forced a weak, exhausted smile onto my face and stepped aside to invite them inside. Monica immediately launched into a theatrical, sickening display of sympathy. She gasped dramatically at the massive size of the white plaster cast encasing my right leg. She hovered around me like a highly concerned private nurse. She loudly complained about how terrible the county hospital conditions must have been. She actually had the nerve to say they would have gladly transferred me to a luxury private facility if Brent had not been so overwhelmed with managing his important corporate accounts. The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was currently wearing a diamond tennis bracelet, bought with my stolen medical premiums, complaining about the hospital she forced me to pay for entirely out of pocket. I did not lash out. I simply nodded, slowly, kept my eyes aimed downward, and thanked her politely for her deep concern. We moved into the kitchen and sat around the dining table. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly strained and heavy. I served the cold takeout onto ceramic plates. Brent barely touched his food. He kept checking his expensive gold wristwatch and tapping his leather shoes impatiently against the linoleum floor. He possessed the frantic, suppressed energy of a cornered animal. He asked me a few superficial questions about my upcoming physical therapy schedule, but his eyes were completely vacant. He was not actually listening to a single word I was saying. His gaze kept darting nervously toward the polished leather briefcase resting firmly against the leg of his chair. He was a man running completely out of time, desperately needing to secure the final piece of his fraudulent puzzle before the major banking institutions closed for the weekend. I played my part perfectly. I acted exactly like the tired, heavily medicated, and easily confused old man he expected me to be. I complained about the dull, throbbing pain in my leg and rubbed my forehead constantly, as if I could not concentrate. I asked him mundane questions about the weather to further cement my image of harmless ignorance. After about 20 minutes of agonizing small talk, Brent abruptly cleared his throat and pushed his half-eaten plate of rice away. He reached down and hoisted the heavy leather briefcase onto the top of the table. He instantly put on his smooth, practiced, professional voice. The fake concerned son vanished completely, replaced by the calculating wealth manager. He told me that since it was tax season, he had taken the liberty of organizing my yearly federal filings to save me the trouble. He claimed the Internal Revenue Service needed a few updated physical signatures on some routine disclosure forms to properly process my standard deduction. It was a flawless, casually delivered lie. He unlatched the brass locks of the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of formal legal documents. He placed them directly in front of me and quickly flipped past the thick paragraphs of text to the final page. He pointed his perfectly manicured index finger at a blank line located at the very bottom of the dense page. He did not offer to let me read the preceding pages. He simply instructed me to sign my name quickly so he could get the paperwork filed by tomorrow morning and secure my tax refund. I leaned forward and looked down at the paper. It was most certainly not a standard tax form. The bold, capitalized header on the document clearly stated it was a final escrow authorization for a maximum payout reverse mortgage. The corporate logo of the massive national bank was printed directly in the top right corner. The specific loan amount was listed plainly at $450,000. My son was sitting across from me, breathing the air in my kitchen, casually asking me to sign away the absolute last piece of security I had in this world. I looked up at his face. His expression was a perfect, impenetrable mask of helpful filial duty. He offered me a warm, encouraging smile. He had absolutely no idea that I knew exactly what he was doing. I slowly reached out and picked up the black ballpoint pen I had carefully placed next to the grocery lists earlier that afternoon. I did not hesitate or show a single ounce of doubt. I uncapped the pen filled with the chemically engineered disappearing ink and pressed the fine tip firmly against the heavy paper. I did not sign my actual legal name. For the last 40 years, my legal signature on every major contract has always included my middle initial. It was the specific verified signature the county bank held on file for all my original mortgage documents. I deliberately omitted the middle initial. I also slanted the letters backward instead of forward and flattened the large loops on my last name. It looked somewhat similar to my general handwriting at a passing glance, but under the microscopic scrutiny of a federal judge or a trained bank auditor, it was undeniably a complete mismatch. The dark ink flowed smoothly onto the paper, leaving a crisp, solid line. I signed the first page. Brent quickly reached out and flipped the document to the second required signature line, his breathing growing slightly heavier. I signed that page exactly the same way. I placed the cap back on the pen and handed the documents directly to him. Brent snatched the paperwork off the table with a speed that betrayed his absolute desperation. He shoved the documents back into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass latches shut. A look of profound, victorious relief washed over his face. The tension left his shoulders entirely. He stood up immediately, claiming he had an incredibly early morning meeting and needed to get back to the city to prepare. Monica perfectly mirrored his sudden urgency, grabbing her designer coat and saying a rushed, overly sweet goodbye. I walked them back to the front door, leaning heavily on my crutches. I watched them walk down the concrete driveway and climb into their new luxury vehicle. The bright red taillights disappeared down the quiet suburban street, leaving me alone in the dark. I closed the front door and locked the heavy deadbolt. The trap was perfectly set. Tomorrow morning, Brent would proudly submit those documents to the National Bank. The bank underwriters would approve the massive wire transfer based on the visual presence of a signature. But by the time my son stood up at the podium to speak at his luxury venture launch gala on Saturday night, the ink on those binding legal documents would be entirely gone. He would be holding a blank piece of paper, and the federal authorities would be holding him. The moment the red taillights of Brent's luxury vehicle disappeared down my quiet suburban street, I turned away from the front window. I did not waste a single second relishing the small victory of the forged signature. The trap had been baited, but the steel jaws still needed to be primed and locked into place. I picked up my cellular phone and dialed Stuart Reed. He answered on the first ring. I told him I had the documents. I told him Brent had taken the bait entirely. Stuart's voice was sharp and purely professional. He told me he was already parked 2 blocks away in a plain dark sedan waiting for my signal. He told me to grab my coat and my crutches. 5 minutes later, Stuart pulled into my driveway. The night air was biting and cold, cutting through my thin jacket as I struggled down the front steps. Getting into the low passenger seat of his sedan, with a heavy plaster cast and aluminum crutches, was agonizing, but the physical pain was completely overshadowed by the sheer momentum of what we were about to do. We were not going to a hospital, and we were not going to a local police precinct. We were driving straight into the heart of downtown Chicago to the federal courthouse. Stuart had spent the last 48 hours calling in every favor he possessed from his 30 years as a federal fraud prosecutor. He had arranged an emergency after-hours meeting with a senior federal judge who specialized in severe financial crimes and corporate malfeasance. The drive downtown was tense and silent. The city lights blurred past the car windows. I looked down at my hands. They were the calloused, scarred hands of a man who had built heating systems for commercial warehouses. Tonight, those same hands were going to dismantle a corrupt wealth management firm. Stuart pulled into a secure underground parking garage beneath the towering federal building. We rode a private elevator up to the chambers of the presiding judge. The hallways were completely empty, the marble floors reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. The judge was a stern, gray-haired woman who looked incredibly tired but completely alert. She was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk stacked high with legal briefs. Stuart did not offer any dramatic introductions. He placed his heavy leather briefcase on her desk, unlatched it, and began pulling out the massive arsenal of forensic evidence we had gathered from my hospital bed. He laid out the digital wire transfer receipts, showing my stolen whole life insurance payout landing in Brent's corporate accounts. He produced the bank statements proving my monthly retirement annuities were being illegally diverted to fund Monica's extravagant personal shopping sprees. He presented the forged digital power of attorney documents. Finally, he detailed the events that had just occurred in my kitchen less than an hour ago, explaining the fraudulent reverse mortgage application and the physically forged signatures Brent was currently carrying in his briefcase. The judge reviewed the documents in absolute silence. The only sound in the massive room was the slow turning of paper. When she finally looked up, her expression was incredibly hard. She did not ask if I was sure I wanted to proceed against my own son. She recognized the sheer scale of the theft and the profound danger I was in. She picked up her pen and began signing the emergency orders Stuart had prepared. The first document she signed was an emergency federal injunction. This order immediately flagged the fraudulent reverse mortgage application pending at the National Bank. The bank would legally accept the paperwork Brent submitted tomorrow morning, but the funds would be completely frozen in a secure federal holding account. Brent would believe the transaction was successful right up until the exact moment he tried to access the money. The second document was far more devastating. It was a direct referral to the Securities and Exchange Commission, commonly known as the SEC. Stuart had compiled enough evidence of Brent illegally commingling client funds and stealing from his own family to trigger an immediate federal audit of his wealth management firm. The judge authorized a complete lockdown of Brent's corporate trading accounts. Every single dollar flowing in or out of his firm would now be closely monitored and ultimately seized by federal investigators. His ability to move money, hide assets, or pay his massive debts was instantly terminated. The third document was a comprehensive identity theft protection order. This legally severed Brent's forged power of attorney, invalidating every single contract or agreement he had ever signed using my name. It placed an impenetrable federal freeze on my credit, ensuring he could never open another credit card or secure another loan using my Social Security number. Finally, the judge approved the most crucial piece of the puzzle. Stewart had drafted the paperwork to legally transfer the complete ownership of my primary residence, the $800,000 property Brent was trying to steal, into a heavily protected, irrevocable living trust. I signed the transfer documents right there in the judge's chambers. The house no longer belonged to Lawrence Campbell, the vulnerable old man. It belonged to a legal entity that could never be touched, leveraged, or sold by anyone other than a court-appointed trustee. We walked out of the courthouse just past midnight. The cold Chicago wind whipped through the concrete canyons of the city. I leaned heavily on my crutches, exhausted to the bone, but my mind was completely clear. The legal guillotine was now fully assembled, hoisted high into the air, and waiting for my son to place his head on the block. He had stolen my money, my health coverage, and my trust. But I had just quietly and permanently stripped him of the only thing he truly cared about. I had taken away his power. Friday morning arrived with a clear blue sky over the Chicago skyline. For my son Brent, this was supposed to be the day of his ultimate victory. He had scheduled a massive opulent event called the Venture Launch Gala for Saturday evening. He had rented the grand ballroom of a 5-star downtown hotel. He had hired a private catering company, a string quartet, and professional lighting technicians. He had invited 200 of the wealthiest private investors in the city. The entire purpose of this extravagant party was to project an image of absolute financial dominance. He needed these high-net-worth individuals to hand over millions of dollars in new capital. But to secure their trust, he had to prove his firm was highly liquid and deeply profitable. He had to hide the massive margin calls and the crippling debts threatening to crush him. That was exactly why he needed the $450,000 from my house. He firmly believed the bank would wire the reverse mortgage funds into his corporate account by Friday afternoon. He planned to use my stolen equity to quietly pay off his aggressive institutional lenders just hours before the investors arrived. He thought he had perfectly orchestrated his own salvation. I spent Friday morning sitting at my kitchen table with Stuart Reed. We drank black coffee and watched a secure federal digital portal on his laptop computer. We did not have to guess what Brent was doing. We knew exactly how the banking system operated. Corporate wire transfers for massive real estate transactions are processed in large daily batches. The final clearing window for the National Bank was scheduled for exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Stewart had explained that when the digital clock struck 2, the bank underwriter would feed the physical escrow documents Brent had submitted into a high-resolution optical scanner. They needed a verified digital copy of my signature to finalize the release of the funds. But the pen I had used the night before was filled with chemically engineered ink. Over the last 18 hours, the dark blue lines I had drawn on that heavy paper had completely evaporated into the air. Brent had walked into the bank and confidently handed them a stack of entirely blank signature pages. The digital clock on Stuart's computer screen slowly ticked toward 2 o'clock. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I was not nervous. I was simply waiting for gravity to take effect. At exactly 2 minutes past the hour, the secure portal flashed with a bright yellow notification. The National Bank had rejected the loan application. The optical scanner had found nothing but blank space where my signature was supposed to be. The automated system immediately flagged the massive discrepancy, but the rejection was only the first domino to fall. Because Stewart and I had visited the federal judge the night before, the banking system was already primed with our emergency injunctions. The moment the loan application was rejected, the bank computer cross-referenced the failure with the Federal Identity Theft Protection Order. A secondary alert was instantly triggered. This alert did not go to a standard customer service representative. It went directly to the Federal Fraud Investigation Unit. The trap we had built was flawless. The banking system recognized that a licensed wealth manager had just attempted to execute a massive unauthorized loan against an elderly client using fraudulent documents. At 10 minutes past 2 o'clock, the heavy federal hammer dropped. The Securities and Exchange Commission executed the judicial order we had secured. We watched the laptop screen as a cascading series of red warnings populated the digital ledger. The federal regulators initiated a complete and total freeze on every single account associated with Brent and his wealth management firm. They locked the primary corporate operating accounts. They locked the client holding funds. They even reached into his personal finances and froze his private checking accounts and the joint credit cards he shared with Monica. Every single drop of digital capital he possessed was instantly turned to stone. I sat back in my chair and took a slow sip of my coffee. I pictured Brent sitting in his sleek downtown office. I imagined him staring at his computer monitor, waiting for the massive deposit to clear so he could pay his lenders. Instead of a green confirmation screen, he would have received a terrifying red error code. He would have frantically refreshed his browser, thinking it was a simple network connectivity issue. He would have picked up his office phone to call his personal banker, demanding to know why the funds had not arrived. And that is exactly when he would have discovered the absolute nightmare he had walked into. A bank representative would not be allowed to give him specific details regarding an active federal investigation. They would only be able to read a legally mandated script. They would inform him that his accounts had been restricted pending a regulatory review. Brent was a seasoned financial operative. He knew exactly what those specific words meant. He knew the federal government was inside his books. The sheer level of panic that must have consumed him in that moment is almost impossible to describe. His entire world was built on the illusion of continuous cash flow. Without access to his accounts, he was completely paralyzed. He could not pay the aggressive institutional lenders who were demanding their money today. He could not pay his office staff. He could not even buy a cup of coffee. He was a man standing on the edge of a sheer cliff who had just realized the ground beneath his feet was already gone. But the most brutal part of his punishment was the timing. It was Friday afternoon. The venture launch gala was scheduled for tomorrow night. The grand ballroom was already decorated. The expensive catering was already prepared. The wealthy investors had already cleared their weekend schedules to attend. Brent could not simply cancel the event. If a wealth management firm abruptly cancels a massive investor gala at the absolute last minute without a valid explanation, it sends a clear, undeniable signal of catastrophic financial distress to the entire market. Word would spread through the wealthy social circles of Chicago within hours. His remaining clients would panic and pull their money out by Monday morning. Canceling the gala would be a public declaration of bankruptcy. He had absolutely no choice. He was completely trapped in a prison of his own making. He had to put on his expensive, custom-tailored suit. He had to comb his hair and practice his charming, confident smile. He had to walk into that grand ballroom and stand in front of 200 powerful millionaires and pretend he was a brilliant, successful visionary. He had to pour expensive champagne and shake their hands, all while knowing his firm was completely dead and the federal authorities were currently tearing through his ledgers. He had to endure hours of agonizing psychological torture, waiting for the inevitable moment when the truth would finally catch up to him. Saturday morning arrived, bringing a cold, bitter wind off the lake. Stuart arrived at my house early. He brought a garment bag containing a dark, tailored suit he had picked up from a local tailor. He had also brought a specialized medical walking boot to replace the heavy plaster cast, allowing me to wear dress trousers and move with slightly more stability on my crutches. We spent the afternoon reviewing the printed copies of the forensic evidence. We had the wire transfer receipts, the forged digital power of attorney, and the official federal freeze orders. We placed them carefully inside a pristine leather presentation folder. While we prepared our final strike, I thought about Monica. She was likely spending her Saturday afternoon at an exclusive downtown salon getting her hair and makeup done for the grand event. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was currently suffocating in debt. She was eager to show off her diamond jewelry and play the role of the wealthy, successful wife. She had actively participated in my financial destruction by happily spending the money Brent stole from me. She enjoyed the lavish lifestyle without ever questioning whose blood was paying for it. Tonight, the illusion she loved so much was going to shatter into 1,000 unfixable pieces. As the sun began to set over the city, I slowly put on my suit. It felt strange to wear formal clothing after so many years in work boots and denim. But tonight, I was not a retired heating contractor. I was an executioner. I adjusted my tie and grabbed the thick rubber grips of my aluminum crutches. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror. My face was lined with age and my hair was gray, but my eyes were clear and completely devoid of mercy. Stuart walked out of the kitchen carrying the heavy leather folder. He looked at me and nodded slowly. It was time to go. My son had prepared a massive, beautiful stage to sell his lies to the highest bidders. We were going to walk right onto that stage and deliver the absolute, undeniable truth. We walked out the front door and got into Stuart's car. We drove toward the towering hotels of downtown Chicago, ready to bring an arrogant thief exactly what he deserved. The grand ballroom of the downtown luxury hotel was a masterclass in fabricated wealth. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm golden light over 200 of the most influential private investors in the city. Waiters in crisp white uniforms moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with expensive champagne and imported caviar. I stood in the darkened hallway just outside the heavy oak double doors. I leaned on my aluminum crutches and listened to the muffled sound of a string quartet playing classical music. Stuart Reed stood directly to my right, wearing his dark tailored suit and holding the leather presentation folder. Flanking us on either side were two uniformed federal marshals. Their presence was imposing and absolute. They were not there to make a scene. They were there to execute a lawful federal warrant. Through the narrow crack in the doors, I could see Monica holding court near the front of the room. She was wearing a floor-length silk gown that sparkled under the chandelier lights. She held a crystal flute of champagne and laughed loudly at a joke made by a wealthy real estate developer. She was completely intoxicated by the illusion of her own success. She had no idea that the credit card she used to buy that dress had been frozen by the federal government exactly 6 hours ago. The string quartet slowly faded out. A polite applause rippled through the massive room as the master of ceremonies approached the main stage. He tapped the microphone and introduced the founder and chief executive officer of the wealth management firm. He introduced my son. Brent walked out from behind a velvet curtain and stepped up to the acrylic podium. The applause grew louder. From a distance, he looked like the perfect picture of a modern financial genius. His custom suit fit perfectly. His hair was impeccably styled. But as I watched him through the crack in the doors, I could see the severe physical toll of the last 6 hours. His face was unnaturally pale. A thick layer of sweat glistened on his forehead, despite the cool air conditioning in the ballroom. His hands gripped the edges of the podium so tightly, his knuckles were completely white. He was a man standing in front of a firing squad, trying to sell them life insurance. He adjusted the microphone and forced a charming smile onto his face. The smile did not reach his eyes. His eyes were wide and filled with a suppressed, frantic terror. He thanked the wealthy investors for their continued trust. He began his rehearsed speech about the volatile nature of the current global market and how his firm was uniquely positioned to protect their assets. He actually used the words impeccable integrity and generational trust. He stood there bleeding from a mortal financial wound and boldly asked 200 millionaires to give him more money. He promised them absolute transparency. He promised to treat their life savings as carefully as he treated his own family. The sheer suffocating hypocrisy of his words echoed through the massive ballroom. He was lecturing the crowd about generational trust less than 24 hours after trying to steal my home and force me onto the street. He was preaching about financial integrity while his corporate accounts were currently locked down by the Securities and Exchange Commission. I looked at Stuart. Stuart looked back at me and gave a single sharp nod. He turned to the two federal marshals. It was time to pull the curtain down on the greatest performance of my son's life. I shifted my weight onto the grips of my crutches. The two federal marshals stepped forward and placed their hands on the heavy brass handles of the double doors. With a single synchronized motion, they pushed the massive oak doors completely open. The heavy doors swung inward with a loud, echoing thud that cut directly through Brent's amplified voice. Every single head in the grand ballroom turned simultaneously toward the back of the room. The waiter closest to the entrance froze completely still. A woman near the back table gasped quietly. I stepped over the threshold and walked into the golden light of the chandelier. I did not rush. I could not rush. Every step required a deliberate, painful swing of my crutches. The rubber tips squeaked sharply against the polished marble floor. Squeak. Step. Squeak. Step. It was a slow, agonizing march, but it commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. Stuart walked one step behind my right shoulder, holding the leather folder like a loaded weapon. The two federal marshals walked shoulder to shoulder behind us. The bright silver badges pinned to their tactical vests caught the light and reflected it back into the crowd. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Wealthy investors are incredibly sensitive to the presence of law enforcement. The comfortable murmur of the crowd vanished instantly. The string quartet lowered their instruments. The absolute silence that fell over the ballroom was heavier than lead. It was the terrifying, breathless silence of a room realizing they are standing in the middle of a massive crime scene. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the podium. I watched the color completely drain from Brent's face. His mouth fell open slightly. His hands began to shake visibly against the clear acrylic stand. He looked at my face and then his eyes darted to the federal marshals walking behind me. In that single fraction of a second, the arrogant wealth manager completely died. The polished professional facade melted away, leaving behind a terrified, desperate thief who finally realized there was absolutely nowhere left to run. Monica stood a few feet away from the stage. Her champagne flute slipped through her fingers and shattered against the floor. The sound of breaking crystal was loud like a gunshot in the silent room. She stared at the federal badges and then looked at her husband. I stopped walking when I reached the exact center of the ballroom. I stood 10 feet away from the front row of wealthy investors. I looked up at my son standing on his elevated stage. He had built this entire kingdom on my stolen security. He had bought this room, this audience, and this temporary power with the money my dead wife saved to protect me. I was not going to let him speak. I was not going to give him a chance to spin another lie. I adjusted my crutches, stood as tall as my broken body would allow, and prepared to execute his public ruin. I moved toward the elevated stage with deliberate precision. The rubber tips of my crutches gripped the carpeted stairs leading up to the platform. Brent took a sudden step backward as I approached him. He looked like a man watching a ghost emerge from the floorboards. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped by the presence of the federal marshals standing at the base of the stairs, and by the hundreds of wealthy investors watching his every move. I did not rush my ascent. I felt the dull ache in my reconstructed leg, but I completely ignored it. I reached the clear acrylic podium and stood directly next to the son who had tried to erase me. Up close, he smelled of expensive cologne and sour, nervous sweat. I looked into his eyes and saw the absolute collapse of his arrogant soul. I did not raise my hand to strike him. I did not yell or scream obscenities. Emotional outbursts are for people who have lost control. I was in absolute control of the entire room. I gently nudged him aside with my shoulder. He was so paralyzed by terror that he stumbled away from the microphone without a single word of protest. I leaned heavily on my right crutch and gripped the edges of the podium with my free hand. I adjusted the flexible neck of the microphone so it pointed directly at my mouth. The low feedback hum echoed softly across the grand ballroom. 200 millionaires stared up at me in stunned silence, waiting for an explanation. I looked out over the sea of custom dresses and tailored suits. I spoke in a calm, steady voice that carried the weight of 40 years of hard labor. I thanked them all for attending this beautiful event. I told them that the man cowering behind me had just introduced himself as a visionary leader built on generational trust. I told them he was an absolute liar. I stated clearly that my name was Lawrence Campbell. I told the wealthy crowd that I was not standing before them as a proud father celebrating his son. I was standing before them as his very first victim. A collective murmur swept through the room like a cold breeze. I saw several investors immediately reach into their pockets and pull out their cellular phones. I continued speaking, keeping my tone perfectly even and relentless. I told the crowd that they were standing inside a burning building. I explained that the wealth management firm they were preparing to invest their millions in was entirely bankrupt. I told them Brent was drowning in massive margin calls and aggressive institutional debt. I warned them that every single promise of financial security he had made tonight was a desperate fabricated illusion designed to steal their capital. Brent let out a pathetic, whimpering sound from the shadows behind me. He took a hesitant step forward and reached out as if to grab the microphone. One of the federal marshals at the base of the stairs simply placed a hand on his heavy-duty belt and glared at him. Brent froze instantly and shrank back into the corner of the stage. The investors in the front row watched this silent exchange with growing horror. They were seasoned financial operatives, and they recognized the absolute authority of federal law enforcement. They knew this was not a simple family dispute. This was a catastrophic corporate takedown playing out in real time. I turned my attention back to the silent crowd. I told them exactly how their brilliant financial manager funded this lavish party. I explained that when his firm began to collapse, he did not seek legitimate loans or restructure his debt. He targeted an old retired heating contractor. I told the room that he had forged my signature to completely liquidate my late wife's life insurance policy. I told them he had deliberately canceled my premium medical insurance to buy luxury vehicles and take expensive ski vacations while I lay in a hospital bed with a shattered leg. I made sure they understood the absolute lack of morality required to execute those crimes. I told them if a man is willing to leave his own injured father bankrupt and uninsured, he will not hesitate for a single second to drain their investment accounts and leave them with absolutely nothing. The reaction from this crowd was devastatingly swift. The polished veneer of the high society gala vanished entirely. The wealthy investors began to stand up from their decorated tables. Men in expensive suits whispered frantically to their wives and business partners. The absolute worst fear of any wealthy individual is the sudden realization that their money is in the hands of a desperate criminal. The trust Brent had spent years cultivating evaporated in less than 3 minutes. He had brought them all here to prove his financial dominance, and instead I had transformed his beautiful ballroom into a public execution chamber. I was not finished. I turned away from the crowd and faced Brent directly. He was trembling violently now. His pristine custom suit hung loosely on his frame, as if he had physically shrunk. I nodded to Stuart Reed, who was waiting patiently at the bottom of the stairs. Stuart walked up the carpeted steps with the cold, terrifying efficiency of a seasoned prosecutor. He unzipped the leather presentation folder he had been carrying all evening. He pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents printed on heavy white paper. Stuart handed the documents to me. I held them up so the entire room could see the bright red federal seals stamped on the front pages. I looked Brent directly in the eyes. I told him the game was completely over. I handed him the first document. I spoke into the microphone so the entire ballroom could hear every single word. I told him he was being officially served with a federal cease and desist order from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I informed him that as of 2 hours ago, every single corporate and personal account tied to his name had been permanently frozen by the United States government. Brent took the paper with shaking hands. He stared at the federal seal in absolute disbelief. He tried to form words, but his throat was completely dry. He looked desperately toward Monica, who was still standing frozen near the front tables. But Monica was not looking back at him with love or support. She was staring at him with pure, unadulterated terror. She finally realized that the luxury vehicles, the designer clothes, and the exclusive country club memberships were all completely gone. The federal freeze meant she was instantly penniless. She took a slow step backward, distancing herself from the sinking ship. She turned around and practically ran toward the exit doors, leaving her husband entirely alone. I pulled the second document from the stack. I handed it to Brent. I told him this was a civil lawsuit filed in the county court. I explained that I was suing him for $800,000 in total damages. I told him the suit covered the stolen insurance funds, the out-of-pocket medical expenses for my shattered leg, and the severe emotional distress he had intentionally inflicted upon me. I watched his eyes scan the heavy legal text. He saw the exact dollar amount printed in bold black ink. He knew he could not pay a single dime of it, because the government now controlled his entire financial existence. I pulled the final document from the folder. This was the piece of paper that would completely break his spirit forever. I handed it to him and explained that it was a verified copy of the irrevocable living trust I had established last night. I told him that the home he had tried to steal with his forged reverse mortgage application was now legally locked away forever. I told him the bank had rejected his blank signature pages this afternoon. I explained exactly how the disappearing ink worked. I watched the brutal realization wash over his face. He finally understood that while he thought he was brilliantly manipulating a helpless old man, I had actually been orchestrating his total destruction from a hospital bed. He collapsed completely. He did not fall to the floor, but his entire posture crumbled. The arrogant wealth manager was completely gone. He looked exactly like a terrified little boy caught in a massive lie. He dropped the federal documents onto the floor of the stage. The heavy papers scattered across the polished wood. He looked out at the massive ballroom. The room was nearly empty now. The wealthy investors had not stayed to watch him cry. The moment they heard the words "federal freeze," they had rushed for the exit doors, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of his massive crimes. The string quartet had packed up their instruments and fled. The waiters had abandoned their silver trays on the empty tables. The beautiful venture launch gala was a complete and total wasteland. The crystal chandeliers illuminated a room filled with nothing but broken promises and shattered crystal. I looked at the man who had traded my life for temporary power. I felt absolutely no pity for him. He had made his choices with cold calculation, and now he was going to suffer the exact consequences of his boundless greed. I turned away from him, gripping the handles of my crutches. I did not say goodbye. I walked slowly to the edge of the stage and began my descent down the stairs, leaving him entirely alone with the federal marshals waiting to place him in handcuffs. I stepped back from the clear acrylic podium and allowed Stuart Reed to take my place. Stuart did not speak a single word to the terrified crowd. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small digital remote control. He pointed it directly at the audiovisual booth located high at the back of the grand ballroom. The massive digital screen hanging directly behind the stage suddenly flickered. The glowing gold logo of my son's wealth management firm vanished into absolute darkness. It was instantly replaced by a stark white presentation slide filled with high-resolution financial documents. The text was massive and completely impossible to ignore. Stuart pressed a button on his remote, and the first slide transitioned onto the screen. It displayed the direct wire transfer receipts from my liquidated whole life insurance policy. A thick red arrow pointed from my stolen retirement funds directly into the primary operating account of Brent's failing company. A collective gasp rippled through the front row of investors. These were people who deeply understood the sacred legal barrier between private client funds and corporate debt. Seeing that barrier completely shattered on a giant screen was their absolute worst nightmare. Stuart pressed the button again. The screen shifted to a detailed side-by-side comparison. On the left side of the screen was the exact certified billing record showing my canceled medical insurance premiums and the subsequent warning letters. On the right side was a high-definition photograph Monica had posted on her social media account. It showed her standing proudly next to her brand-new luxury Porsche utility vehicle. Directly below the photograph was the certified bank ledger proving that the exact dollar amount stolen from my healthcare coverage had been wired directly to that specific luxury car dealership. The visual proof was absolutely devastating and undeniable. I had just shown 200 millionaires that their visionary financial manager was willing to let his own father suffer in a hospital bed with a shattered leg just so his wife could drive a German sports car. Stuart brought up a final slide. This one showed the forged power of attorney document placed side by side with the rejected reverse mortgage application from that very afternoon. He highlighted the missing digital signature, proving to the entire room that the firm was operating on entirely fabricated legal authority. The investors saw the sheer profound desperation of a man trying to steal the roof over his injured father's head just to cover his massive corporate losses. The reaction from the wealthy crowd was instantaneous and completely ruthless. There was no polite whispering or hesitant pauses to wait for an explanation. The wealthy investors recognized the massive federal trap closing around the room, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. Entire tables of people stood up simultaneously. Chairs scraped loudly against the polished marble floor. Men and women in expensive formal wear turned their backs on the stage and walked swiftly toward the heavy oak exit doors. The sound of 200 people rushing to leave was deafening. Glasses of expensive champagne were knocked over, spilling freely onto the pristine white tablecloths. They were not just leaving a bad party. They were frantically pulling out their cellular phones as they walked, dialing their personal attorneys and secondary brokers to ensure their own funds were safe from the blast radius of this federal investigation. In the brutal world of high finance, a federal freeze is a highly contagious disease, and my son was patient zero. Within 3 minutes, the grand ballroom was completely empty of investors. The only people left in the massive echoing space were myself, Stuart, the 2 federal marshals, and the completely ruined man shivering on the stage. Brent watched his entire future walk out the door. His shoulders slumped forward, and he stared blankly at the floor. The older federal marshal stepped forward and walked up the carpeted stairs. He did not read Brent his rights with any dramatic flair. He spoke in a low professional voice that carried a heavy, undeniable finality. He instructed Brent to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Brent did not resist or try to argue his innocence. He was completely broken. He turned around slowly and presented his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking into place echoed sharply through the silent ballroom. The marshal informed him that he was being placed under federal arrest for severe wire fraud, identity theft, and aggravated elder abuse. They guided him down the stairs. His expensive leather shoes dragged heavily against the carpet. He looked absolutely nothing like a visionary corporate leader anymore. He looked exactly like a common thief being hauled away from a massive crime scene. I followed them out of the ballroom, leaning heavily on my crutches. We walked through the long carpeted hallway and entered the massive marble lobby of the downtown hotel. Monica was standing near the front revolving doors holding her designer wool coat. She was aggressively tapping her cellular phone screen with her manicured fingernails. She had just discovered that her platinum credit cards had been completely declined by the hotel valet service. She looked up from her screen and saw her husband walking toward her in federal handcuffs, flanked by armed officers. Brent looked at her with desperate, pleading eyes. He was begging for a single ounce of loyalty or comfort from the woman he had destroyed his entire life to please. He quietly asked her to call his corporate lawyers and find a way to post his bail. Monica stared at the steel handcuffs and then looked directly at me. She processed the brutal reality of her new situation with terrifying speed. The stolen money was completely gone. The luxury cars would be seized by the government by morning. The lavish life she worshipped was entirely dead. She did not cry or reach out to touch her husband. She looked back at Brent with absolute cold disgust. She told him he was a complete fool for getting caught and ruining her life. She turned around, her silk gown sweeping across the marble floor, and walked out the revolving doors into the cold Chicago night. She left him standing there in the hotel lobby, completely abandoned by the only person he thought he could trust. The marshals pushed him forward toward the waiting federal transport vehicle, and I watched the last remaining piece of his fabricated world turn to absolute dust. 6 months have passed since the night the chandelier lights went out on my son's fabricated empire. The bitter Chicago winter has finally surrendered to the warmth of early summer, and the heavy plaster cast on my leg has been permanently removed. Brent is currently sitting in a high-security federal holding facility, awaiting his final sentencing hearing. His wealth management firm no longer exists. The sleek glass office downtown was completely liquidated by the federal government to pay off the massive institutional debts he recklessly accumulated. He is facing a maximum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and aggravated elder abuse. Monica filed for divorce the very same week the corporate bank accounts were frozen. She quickly realized there was absolutely no money left to salvage and abandoned him completely to save her own social reputation. He writes me letters from his cell from time to time, begging for a second chance and asking me to speak to the judge on his behalf. I do not read them. I simply drop the unopened envelopes directly into the paper shredder sitting next to my desk. The financial damage he caused was severe, but it was certainly not permanent. Stuart Reed proved to be worth every single penny of his legal fee. He worked relentlessly alongside the federal prosecutors to untangle the massive web of stolen assets. Because we had frozen the accounts before Brent could hide the money offshore, the government was able to completely seize his remaining corporate holdings. Last Tuesday, I received a certified wire transfer returning the entire $250,000 he stole from my late wife's life insurance policy. The money was placed safely back into the secure trust where it truly belongs. But the absolute most satisfying moment of the entire recovery process involved the luxury vehicle Monica loved so much. The federal marshals seized the brand new Porsche utility vehicle straight from her suburban driveway. Because the car was explicitly purchased using my stolen medical premiums, the court awarded the vehicle directly to me as financial restitution. I did not keep it. I had it sold at a private auto auction the very next day. I took the massive cash payout from the sale of that German sports car and used it to pay off the remaining balance of my complex orthopedic surgery. The exact luxury vehicle my son bought to elevate his fake social status while I lay suffering in a county hospital ended up paying for the titanium plates now permanently screwed into my right shin. The pure poetic justice of that financial transaction brings me a deep and profound sense of peace. The ledgers are finally balanced, and the thief has been completely stripped of his stolen crown. I sit on the front porch of my home early this Tuesday morning, watching the neighborhood slowly wake up. The air is warm and carries the scent of fresh-cut grass. I stretch my right leg out in front of me, resting my foot on the wooden railing. There is no plaster cast, and there is no pain. The titanium plates in my shin are completely healed, allowing me to walk unassisted and without a limp. I hold a ceramic mug of black coffee in my hands, feeling the heat radiate through my calloused palms. This house is completely quiet, and for the first time in my entire life that silence does not feel like loneliness. It feels like an absolute impenetrable fortress of peace. Yesterday afternoon, I finalized the last piece of paperwork with Stuart Reed. The wealth I spent 40 years building on freezing commercial rooftops is no longer tied to my family name. I have legally transferred every single dollar of my estate into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. But this trust is not designed to fund luxury ski vacations or buy German sports cars. It is entirely dedicated to a local vocational trade school right here in Chicago. The funds will be used to provide full scholarships, heavy equipment tools, and apprenticeships for young men and women who want to work with their hands. I decided to give my life savings to kids who understand the true value of a split knuckle and a hard day's work. They will learn how to build real, functional things instead of learning how to steal from the people who love them. My son thought he could manage my life because he believed an expensive suit made him superior to a man in work boots. He learned the incredibly hard way that true power is not found in a corporate bank account or a country club membership. Power is found in the absolute clarity of the truth. People often say that blood is thicker than water and that family must be forgiven no matter the terrible cost. I completely disagree with that weak philosophy. Sharing a bloodline does not guarantee loyalty or basic human decency. It does not grant anyone a free pass to exploit your physical vulnerabilities or drain your financial resources. Respect must be continuously earned, and trust must be fiercely protected against anyone who tries to abuse it. When Brent looked at me, he saw an old, tired man he could easily discard. He assumed my love for him would blind me to his predatory greed. But the ledger of my life is now perfectly balanced. He took exactly what he thought he deserved, and the justice system handed him exactly what he earned. I take a slow sip of my dark coffee and watch the morning sun rise over the quiet suburban rooftops. I do not have a son anymore, and I do not have a daughter-in-law to visit me. But I have my dignity, my safe home, and my absolute unshakable freedom. And as the warm summer breeze brushes across the porch, I realize that is more than enough. The most profound lesson to be drawn from this entire ordeal is the absolute necessity of maintaining personal boundaries even, and perhaps especially, with those who share your bloodline. We are often culturally conditioned to believe that family requires unconditional sacrifice and infinite forgiveness, regardless of the severity of the betrayal. This story violently shatters that dangerous myth. True loyalty is not an automatic right granted by genetics. It is a sacred privilege that must be continuously earned through mutual respect, honesty, and consistent care. When a family member chooses to weaponize your love and exploit your vulnerabilities for their own selfish gain, they forfeit that privilege entirely. True strength is not found in silent suffering endurance, but in having the courage to protect your own dignity, demand accountability, and walk away from toxicity even when it means severing the closest ties you have. You must learn to love yourself enough to establish absolute consequences for unforgivable actions. If this story resonated with you or helped you recognize a toxic pattern in your own life, please share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of resilience and truth.